All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to introduce myself. Hello there. My name is Jeremy Chen, and I'm a reporter with 13 Action News in Las Vegas, the ABC station there. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Now, we are here at the event hosted by OCA Las Vegas Fighting COVID-19 and Racism Impacts on the Asian Community. Now, this is in collaboration with the Nevada Minority Health and Equity Coalition and UNLV School of Public Health as part of the One Community, One Response program. Thank you to everyone who is tuned in via Zoom and also on Facebook Live through OCA Las Vegas. Now, we have a great lineup of speakers here with us today to share their stories and talk about this very important and timely topic. Now, before we begin, I would like to introduce Nicole Santero to provide some brief remarks. Take it away, Nicole.
Thank you, Jeremy. And hello, everyone. I am Nicole Santero. I'm the Director of Communications for the UNLV School of Public Health. I also serve on the boards of the Nevada Minority Health and Equity Coalition and OCA Las Vegas. And so being a part of all three of the organizations that have put together today's event, in addition to being an Asian American myself, I'm very proud to welcome you to this webinar on this topic. I want to first take a moment to thank our sponsors for today. That includes Cox Communications, Caesars Entertainment, MGM Resorts International, Arcata Associates, the Asian Community Development Council, and the Asian Community Resource Center. And so this event is being held, as Jeremy said, in collaboration as part of the One Community, One Response campaign. And this campaign is focused on addressing the impacts of COVID-19 on our most vulnerable populations. And we've really seen how the Asian American and Pacific Islander community has been greatly impacted during this pandemic, not just in Nevada, but across the country. In terms of cases and death rates, we saw how COVID-19 disproportionately affected Asian American and Pacific Islanders. And on top of this, as our speakers will be focused on today, the pandemic has further fueled the rise of discrimination and incidents of hate against Asian Americans. So today we're really honored to be joined by our four panelists who will be sharing their perspectives and their stories, and you'll learn about what they're doing to address and combat some of these issues. And so this is just one of the several conversations we hope to be having over the next few weeks and months to continue highlighting the various impacts of COVID-19 on our communities. But in the meantime, I'd like to pass it back to Jeremy to introduce our panelists. So thank you again for being with us here today for this discussion. And please continue to take the necessary steps to keep yourself and your loved ones safe and healthy during this time.
All right, thank you very much, Nicole, for your remarks. Now, we have four speakers with us from all across the country who are leading the conversation and efforts to support and advocate for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Now, I want to give each of them a moment to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Maggie Sue. Go ahead, Maggie.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Shu, and I'm a co-founder of Gold House, and I'm also a co-founder of Mochi magazine.
All right, thank you, Maggie. Let's head over to Mike Keogh.
Thank you, Jeremy. My name is Mike Keogh. I'm the founder of the I'm Virus campaign and an activist in residence at the University of Connecticut's Asian and Asian American Studies Institute.
Awesome, thanks, Mike. Now let's move over to Kat Moon.
Thank you, Jeremy. My name is Kat Moon. I'm a journalist at Time, and I am on the audience engagement team, and I also report on cultural stories largely focused on the Asian and Asian American communities.
All right, thank you, Kat. Let's move over to Nguyen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nguyen. I'm the National Director at OCA National Center. So we are the headquarters and parent organization of OCA Las Vegas.
Awesome. And those are your four panelists. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Now let's get started on today's discussion. And I want to thanks to everyone who have submitted questions for our panelists. Our first question for today is going to go to from OCA. Now, OCA is an organization with chapters all over the country dedicated to advancing the social, political, and economic well-being of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Now, over the last year, we've seen how COVID-19 and the pandemic has greatly impacted the AAPI community. Can you help to provide an overview and understanding of what they've been going through?
Yeah, of course. So at the beginning of stay-at-home orders and when we really started hearing COVID-19 virus spread into the US, our community first faced a fear of COVID-19. A lot of our community owns small businesses. A lot of our community is in the healthcare industry. And then a lot of our community are elders. And so those are frontline workers, vulnerable populations to COVID-19. And so it was a fear that would impact our livelihoods and impact our health, our elders at home. But it went very quickly from a fear of just the COVID-19 virus to a fear of anti-Asian hate when we started seeing a lot of rhetoric and hearing a lot of rhetoric coming from leadership across the country, around China virus and the stereotyping that Chinese folks have brought over the virus to America. And of course, that led to stereotyping of all faces that look similarly East Asian, right? I'm Vietnamese American, but I have a sort of East Asian face. And so our community then faced a fear of anti-Asian hate. And that was seen in schools. We had children reporting school bullying. We saw anti-Asian hate in small businesses, both towards Asian business owners and discrimination of by like people not patronizing Asian businesses, but also hate incidences happening in small businesses. 40% of the hate incidences, anti-Asian hate incidences we've seen reported happen in a business location. And then, our elders and our women especially are more vulnerable to physical attacks of violence. And so they also faced, this fear of like going out and about. And 68% right now we've seen the latest report back in January, 68% of anti-Asian hate incident reports were from Asian women. And so that's kind of the timeline that it escalated really quickly, right? January to about March, April, as we've seen those hate reports. Yeah.
Of course. Thank you too for sharing your thoughts, and definitely, fighting the virus on two fronts, the virus itself and the prejudice and racism that comes with it, which kind of segues to Mike Keogh. Now, this pandemic obviously influenced the creation of the hashtag I Am Not a Virus campaign. Can you tell us about the campaign and how it all got started?
Thank you. Attacks against Asian Americans aren't new. We've been attacked for outsourcing, for foreign wars, for viruses, right? And so I came to the campaign knowing that our community is attacked every 3 to 5 years for existing. And I came to this campaign with a lot of emotions as the son of refugees. I'm Cambodian American. My parents are older refugees. And as the parent of 2 young Asian American children under 5, I came in here thinking about what that means. This meant that my parents couldn't go shopping. They couldn't go to the grocery stores in fears of attacks. And you heard the rhetoric that, Tu was mentioning with our leadership, calling this the Chinese flu or the Wuhan flu, the Chinese virus. And I think of Tong Pak Davong, Laotian grandfather who was killed in 2001 for the war in Vietnam by a neighbor. There was a young man by the name of Vanny Fong, who at 13 was killed by an 11-year-old in front of his 8-year-old brother for being an Asian American teenager. So none of this was new. And what frustrated me was this idea of belonging. We should feel safe because we exist. Simple as that, not because the idea of the American dream or nationalism and the land of opportunities. We should feel safe anywhere we are. And as a father, I worry about the safety of my children. And we saw that unfold in Minneapolis this past week with Dante Wright that was, shot and killed by a police officer. And so the campaign came up with a slogan: if we are not viruses, then what are we? We deserve safety. And I photographed Asian Americans to, give them this opportunity to say who they are, what they loved about themselves, as well as push this narrative that we all deserve to be safe because we are here, and an attack against one of us is an attack against all of us. And I think this is why that Asian Americans need to stand in solidarity with Black, Brown, immigrant, and trans communities across the board, because we all deserve safety.
Thank you, Mike, for your remarks. And definitely we are hearing a lot more voices within the API community speak out against racism, which segues over to Maggie. Now, Gold House is all about raising the voices of Asians and Pacific Islanders. Can you tell us your overall mission, how your overall mission has been shaped further during the pandemic and with the rise of anti-Asian hate?
Sure, thanks. So, Gold House was really convened as a group of individuals, so Asian creatives, founders, corporates, to really come together and ensure authentic representation for our people. That could be in entertainment, that could be in the boardroom, that could be in business and in film. But I think one of the things that happened when we first started Gold House was people said there are already so many different Asian organizations out there. How is this going to be any different, right? You have organizations by type of work, the journalists and the lawyers, and you have the Chinese organizations, the Japanese organizations. And just for us, it was really, let's bring together all, not, kind of everyone for, in a positive way. And I think one of the things that we've seen that we've always started with was something called Gold Open. And Gold Open is this initiative to ensure the box office opening weekend success of films with authentic Asian representation. So things like Crazy Rich Asians, Minari, Parasite, Mulan. And I think, throughout the past year, this has become even more critical to show these stories and showcase these stories because at the end of the day, a lot of people and culture is determined by what we're seeing on the small and large screens. And so to have those different stories, I think is so important. And so, now more than ever, we're looking to keep that going in terms of films that really, showcase the diversity of our people.
All right, thank you very much, Maggie. Now let's move over to Kat. And Kat, I understand you yourself have recently reported on anti-Asian violence and how to combat it. Now, what role does the media play in uplifting the voices of the AAPI community, especially during this time?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Well, I think there are two parts of this, one being how the media, and I'm talking about newsrooms, can uplift voices of the AAPI community through our reporting, and the other being how newsrooms can uplift the voices of the AAPI journalists they have on staff, and oftentimes those are very connected. So for the first part, through our reporting, the story you're referring to is one I did after the Atlanta area shootings, coming up with a page of resources on different ways that people can help combat anti-Asian violence, whether it is through volunteering at initiatives like Main Street Patrol in Flushing or Compassion in Oakland, and also includes ways to donate to organizations. And I mean, I was very happy to see that we were not the only publication that had a piece like that, and that many different grassroots organizations led by AAPI community leaders were being highlighted. And I would also say so much of the conversation that's been happening in our newsroom is how do we make sure we continue to highlight or cover the AAPI community, not just in times of trauma and tragedy, but all the time. And I think it is this is something that's actually very tied to my culture reporting, and I'm happy that when I go look at my author page to check if I have diverse sources on my page, I see mostly Asians, and right now on the first page, there are people from my entertainment reporting, ranging from K-drama actors to Raya from Raya and the Last Dragon to Tanjiro from Demon Slayer, and I think just seeing a range of Asian American faces, but also characters, and being able to tell their stories as multifaceted stories, and figuring out a way to continue that coverage, and not only cover the tragedy and trauma, but also any milestones that are reached, or how people in the community are shaping their industries. I think that's very important. Yeah, and then on the note of newsrooms empowering their AAPI staff to be, to sometimes lead the coverage on the attacks or on the AAPI community in general. I was looking at AJA, Asian American Journalists Associations, and how they put out a statement a few days after the shootings, how they were urging newsrooms to empower, their API journalists after hearing incidents where people were asked things like, are you sure your bias won't show if you cover the Atlanta shootings, or you might be too emotionally invested to cover this story? And it was just quite upsetting to hear these things. And I was grateful that at time a community of the AAPI journalists, I feel like, were given the opportunities and were brainstorming together, pitching things, and also in less than a day put together a cover story package on, with the cover, we are not silent, and that was really powerful just to see AAPI staff being empowered to do that. And so I think just seeing how AAJA recommended that and making sure that they are saying for newsrooms to offer the opportunities, but to people who want to cover it, because not everyone does, and there is a lot of emotional burden that comes with a lot of the coverage. So I think it's important, for people who are looking for those opportunities to either be offered them or for opportunities to be created for the API journalists.
Awesome. Thank you for your insight, Kat. And I can certainly relate with empowering the API journalists within the newsroom. I myself am an API journalist, and it's so important not just to have representation within your rank and file, but also representation within management to the very people you are pitching those stories, so they do understand, how important it is to accurately and effectively report on the API community, especially during this time. Thank you again, Kat, for your thoughts. Now we're going to move on. We're going to go back to two. Now, there are many chapters across the U.S. that exist under the OCA umbrella. Now, what proactive steps and strategies has your organization taken and encouraged in order to address issues in the AAPI community that have arisen during COVID-19?
Sure. So, beyond COVID-19, like fear of COVID-19, what came with that was a need for resources for small businesses and support on information about COVID-19. There was a lot of misinformation going around in the API community. And then also a lot of our community members, a good number of them were experiencing discrimination and hate for the first time if they lived in areas before where they were fortunate not to experience it, right? So, and then also just access to virtual education and access to resources that aided them during COVID-19. These are kind of the things that were impacting and are still impacting our community. And so, nationally, from the national headquarters, we started partnering with other organizations such as the APIA Health Forum in putting out information on COVID-19 and making sure they were translated into Asian languages, because that was a big barrier that we were seeing from government, is that, CDC and SBA were not putting out resources in Asian languages, right? And our community speaks a diversity of languages. And so we were working with other national API orgs to translate materials as fast as we could and get that out there. And then also provide education and rapid response on anti-Asian hate. Not only is that how do you respond to what a hate incident is, or when you get a report to it, but how do you mobilize your community around it? We saw a lot of OCA chapters who previously just did, kind of cultural events. They started doing advocacy things for the first time, how to host a press conference, rallies. And so we see a lot of mobilization and activation within our chapters, as well as, delivering PPE, delivering food to frontline workers in their community, and delivering groceries to elders. We saw, that's the strength of OCA chapters, is that they have members in these different cities that are able to get resources to their fellow community members. And so we were funneling funding and in-kind donations through our chapter so that they could get the PPE, the food, the money out to, the API's low-income families and those in need. And then the other thing that is kind of overlooked is the technology gap, the digital divide that many of our community face, whether they are not actually connected to the internet and don't have broadband access, or they're not digitally literate, right? And with the pandemic, a lot of things transitioned virtually. We saw a lot of usage of telehealth, which, a lot of our elders, didn't, don't know how to navigate that telehealth world, or, we're not able to visit our elders. And so a lot of them were navigating how to stay connected with their family for the first time, whether that's FaceTime, as easy as that, or Zoom. And then our students, API low-income students were forced to stay home, and they either had weak connection to internet that couldn't do Zoom learning, or they had no devices. And so thankfully, we were able to get a grant through Walmart to distribute 121 laptops to low-income API students across the country. But when we did a survey through Untitled colleges, which is Untitled is API serving institutions, there were about 6,000 students who were college students only, who were in need of laptops to study at home. And so that's not taking into account, our high schoolers, our elementary schoolers. And so there's this big digital divide that we've been seeing and trying to address. And then, just funneling resources like Lyft, who was able and is still able to provide us with some ride vouchers to get folks to do their essential travel or to get their COVID vaccine. And so these are just ongoing efforts that we are still doing nationally and locally within all of our chapters.
All right, thank you very much. Let's head over to Mike. So what are some of the key outcomes of the hashtag I am not a virus, and what kind of materials have been created as part of this campaign?
One of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to provide the language needed for Asian Americans to express themselves. Many of us had experienced racism before this pandemic, and these experiences, many people have a tough time calling it racist, and it's because the Asian American experience isn't really well known. For example, when I was younger, I was accused of plagiarizing several times in my K-12 experience. And each time my parents felt that I was writing or reading above grade level, that I was smarter than my peers. In reality, it was because my school district was calling my house, and my grandmother would pick up, who speaks 5 languages, but not English. So she'd answer in broken English. And they would assume that because my grandmother is a non-English speaker and I grow up in this refugee household, maybe I shouldn't have the same language access as my peers, So framing that in a way where it is culturally relevant to our community, and the fact that, many of us do grow up working class or in the homes of immigrant households, and what that means. So in doing so, we created a coloring book for Asian American students as well as educators. It is called History is Colorful. It includes biracial representation, Southeast Asian, South Asian, queer, East Asian representation across the board. We partner up with Admirations to do so. We've created a mental health workbook for college students to access their identity through creative outlets, through poetry, which was kind of the driving force of my intro to Asian America 15 years ago, was through poetry. So through poems and literature, there's these devices where Asian Americans can understand that fear they had of bringing their own lunches to school and why they felt that way. The Asian American experience is often mocked, and this mockery leads to these attacks within our community. It leads to housing and job discrimination. It leads to health disparities, right? Asian Americans during this pandemic were at a higher risk, right? And so we've been working on that. I am excited to share that we have HB 6619 in Connecticut, which includes Asian and Pacific American studies within the grades K-8. And so we've been working hard on that with Make Us Visible. And we have 27 co-sponsors right now. It just left the education committee last week, and it's currently in appropriations. So, after Atlanta, we've also put together templates for parents to get a response from their school districts. Many of us as parents don't know where to even begin. The last year we've been working with the town of West Hartford to advocate for Asian Americans within locally. And so they had a statement out within 12 hours with actionable items that not just Asian American parents, but for all parents within the school district to catch up on, to learn about Asian Americans, to be able to talk to their children about anti-Asian racism. You know, we believe a community needs to exist, and we've been able to create this hub where we bring in all these folks to come work with us, right? They don't have to be Asian Americans. We have allies from across you know, different organizations that have come on, and we're maintaining that momentum. So with this template that we put out, we've heard from other cities like Portland, Oregon, the biggest school district in Oregon, actually got a letter because of this template, you know, in support of Asian Americans. So that's kind of what we work on, is this idea of accessibility, what it means, and how do you make things accessible. If you want us to report hate crimes, then when a hate crime or hate incident is reported, then it needs to be what it's called. It needs to be dealt with accordingly. There was a gentleman in Connecticut recently that tried to run over Asian American male who was walking his dog, and he was let go on a promise. You know, we need to have a discussion on what that means, and that lack of transparency or that lack of care prevents Asian Americans from coming up and saying like, hey, I was too hurt. Or you have a community garden, you're looking for immigrant populations or like Asian Americans to come in, then it needs to have culturally relevant foods for us to feel seen, heard, and wanted, you know? So that's kind of like what our campaign works on.
All right, thank you, Mike. No, let's go over to Maggie. Now, Gold House has included ventures like the All of Us movement. How important has it been to come together and build bridges with other communities during the rise of COVID-19?
Yeah, first off, Mike, that's incredible. Would love to support. I think the educational component is so important. It's something that's you'll see long-term. We'll hopefully see long-term results. On the Gold House side, I think there's two components. One, as Kat mentioned, there's a need to highlight what isn't working, right? So all the bad stories and what's not going well. And so we partnered with GoFundMe for a fundraiser, and the original goal was $1 million. It was a Stop Asian Hate community fund, and I just checked, we're now almost at $6 million. But what I think is most exciting is not the amount of money, but it's the number of donors. So it's almost 47,000 donors, and so that's folks across every community, me sending it to my friends who are Asian and not Asian, and that kind of word of mouth, I think is one pretty straightforward way, because I in many ways still feel helpless, but if I can do something or I can give something, I can be part of this cause. And a lot of my friends reached out, they said, how can I help? That's one clear way. And then the second thing is by also actively bridging to other communities like the Black community and the Latinx community. So we've done a number of town halls, called them Black and Gold. We're kind of working with other communities to better understand some key learnings and best practices we can share between us, and we've seen some really incredible results. And at every one of our events, we host salons and talks for our members. We make sure that we're inviting folks from other communities in, because we don't want to be in this echo chamber where we all kind of agree with each other. We want to other folks to challenge us and vice versa. So I think kind of the two ways we think about it is, one is working to counteract some of the more immediate negative things that are happening, and then longer term building those bridges.
Absolutely, Maggie. Very important to do that. Let's go over to Kat, and no doubt that the coverage of anti-Asian hate and violence have been driven by Asian American journalists such as yourself. Now, for you, how have your identity and experiences factored in your reporting?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. So I am Taiwanese, born and raised in Taipei, and following the Atlanta shootings, definitely hearing the Mandarin names really hit me hard, since they are so similar to my own name. And thankfully, I felt the need that we need to get this right when we are publishing these names. And thankfully, AAJ posted the pronunciation guide for the names of different Asian victims. And along with that, they also had posted, a note saying that these names should not be abbreviated into middle names, because oftentimes Korean names and Mandarin names have two characters making up the first name. So, it was important for me to drop that in our Slack channel and then ask if we could update our stories so that the names are no longer abbreviated. Yeah, and I would also say an important part, since I have experienced my identity being misunderstood, I guess. I mean, having a historically Korean sounding last name, every few weeks, someone's surprised to find out that I'm Taiwanese. And I think it is so important for me as a journalist to ask my sources, how they identify ethnically, and to not make any assumptions. So whether it was doing phone calls or reporting at the rally on Black Asian solidarity that I covered, I asked people how they identify, and also knowing that there is a difference between, let's say, Taiwanese and Taiwanese American, and those are very different experiences. So would be sure to ask that as a follow-up. And, I admittedly have had to make a correction with a source who, who identifies as Malaysian instead of Malaysian American. And I think after that incident, I definitely know to make sure to ask that question, and, just add it to the end of all of my interviews. And I think these stories being so personal, seeing the Atlanta shootings, and being an Asian person and a woman, really feeling strong emotions toward it. I know that we have to cover the stories showing the human side of things. And I do think it is so important and great that these days we have more and more data showing and tracking the incidents against Asians and the anti-Asian attacks, but at the same time, it is important to hear their voices, hear their stories, and a lot of the times that would also require, oftentimes being able to speak the people's languages to just have that more personal conversation. And I am, I think, one of the few journalists at time who speaks Mandarin. So also during that week following the shootings, was asked to help with different types of translations. And I think, I was very thankful to be able to assist in some cases, but also know, it is a type of extra burden that can fall on to AAPI journalists. So I guess that kind of ties into a general recommendation to newsrooms, to either look for, when hiring, look for staff who can speak different languages, or have resources where freelance translations can be available in instances like covering these attacks, because I do think so much more of the story can be told.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kat. And good to see a fellow Taiwanese American on the panel as well. I'm Taiwanese American as well, and I can certainly relate to the accurately pronounced, especially the Mandarin names correctly. I did personally retweet the actual names of both traditional and simplified Chinese, as well as the pinyin, in order to help people. And I believe AAJ did retweet that. But just the fact that getting the names correct is so essential, and a sign of respect that you actually took the time and took a look at who these people were. So definitely, that is just so important, having that presence and having that experience to contribute inside a newsroom. Now we're going to move on to Maggie. Now, one of the top questions we received was, how can people help advocate for the AAPI community and be an ally? Now, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I struggle with this because there are so many ways it can almost feel like you don't know where to start sometimes. And so I think, there are ways to do it digitally. There are ways to do it in person, like bystander training. So a couple ones that come to mind are, one, just your personal interactions on a day-to-day basis, both at work and in your community, and just having empathy and trying to really understand the stories of everyone you were talking to. And I worked for the late Tony Hsieh, and one of the things that, I really admired about him was he thought everyone had a story, right, to tell, and it was a meaningful story. And so, everyone from the random person on the street, or, to an executive at the company at Zappos, he was always interested in what they had to share. So I think that's, one area as an ally, just taking the time to, get to know your coworkers and hearing their stories. And, I think there are a number of different things, right? So the improving reporting of hate crimes, improving coverage, these micro moments, bystander training, like the list is endless. I think everyone probably has a way in which they can contribute best. And so this is one that I recommend. The others are, go shop at Asian businesses, Asian owned businesses. And I think that's, to me, probably the second one. And it's almost like a very easy, like a very simple thing to do, right? We actually just partnered with Yelp to denotate Asian owned businesses. So you can do that, right? And I think people have good intentions. I like to assume that, but they're creatures of habit. So we're trying to put together little ways in which they can help be an ally. But yeah, it's a ramble, because I just, I'd love to hear other people's thoughts too, because I feel like there are so many ways. How do we even begin to, pick one or help our friends and allies, come to the table consistently for us?
And you bring up a good point, Maggie, and I kind of want to open up to the other three panelists. What do you think is a good way for allies, especially if there's someone from outside of the AAPI community, to be an ally and advocate for us? Anyone can chime in.
So I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I think one thing that would be huge are for our allies to center their stories around Asian Americans. I've been in spaces where there are allies, white allies, that are uncomfortable by our stories. They're uncomfortable by our experiences, but the experience of people of color are uncomfortable. We face microaggressions many times. There are times where we are the only person that looks like ourselves in the room, and someone may say something, And so when we do finally share our stories, there's a need for this emotional outpour, right? And when I say emotional outpour, I mean you all probably heard the story where it's like, where someone goes like, "I'm not racist, let me tell you why," And so there's moments where we have these conversations that are daunting on us, that hurt us, hurt our souls. So I think that it is imperative for our allies that want to stand with us to be able to hold in our discomfort. If they need to unpack it, they can unpack it with a group of friends elsewhere. But for this moment, stay, listen, learn. I think to do so, we have to understand why we got into equity in the first place. So many of our allies got into equity for a certain reason, So there was a personal experience that led them to where they are today. And go back to that moment, dig from that well, and carry on. Because for equity to exist, we need to forgive ourselves. We need to have the capacity to let others learn. And but don't unpack our stories in a what's called back to us when we're just looking for support. I think that's one thing that I've been experiencing a lot.
Gotcha. Kat, too, any thoughts about advocating for our community? All right. Gotcha. You have something too?
Oh, I was just going to add to what Mike said, which I +1 a lot, but is that we talk a lot about self-care during this time of the pandemic for everybody. But I just learned a phrase today from Tavai, who's the ED of EPIC, Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, that we should be leaning into community care as well, because we didn't get into this pandemic ourselves, and we didn't get into this these anti-Asian hate, the epidemic of hate, or pitting communities of color together. Like, we didn't get into that individually ourselves. And so we need to be checking in on one another. And I think for our white allies to be understanding, like Mike said, try to open up your minds and the understanding of like how we are doing and how we operate, and check in with your colleagues, your employees. And yeah, so this is a call out, to supervisors and managers to check in on your API folks.
Of course. And I'm going to stay with you too. Now, with the hate incidents escalating due to the pandemic, the horrible incidents we've seen in places like New York City and San Francisco, it's more important than ever to not be a bystander. Now, one of the issues is sometimes people may not know what constitutes a quote unquote hate crime or hate incident. Now, can you help shed light on what fits into that category and how someone can go about reporting these types of incidents?
Sure. So I want to preface that whether you're a bystander to a hate crime or hate incident, which you won't know immediately until you process it, you want to be recording and reporting it right away, no matter what it is. And so I'm going to drop 2 links into the chat box to 2 reporting sites. One is with the California Coalition, stopapihate.org, and then one which is OCA's apihatecrimes.org. Both are hate incident collectors. And so the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident is a hate crime is a criminal offense committed against person or property and motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against a race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, gender, or disabilities, these protected classes, right? So some examples of that are battery, assault, and vandalism. But the key to a hate crime is that when you're evaluating this incident, if whether or not it's a crime can be pretty obvious, but is the incident motivated by a bias, which can be pretty difficult to show that something is a hate crime. Whereas a hate incident is any act, conduct, or speech or expression that is bias motivated, but not punishable under the law. And so we want to encourage everybody to, whether or not you know right away if something is a hate crime or a hate incident, to be recording and to report right away to any supervisor, any manager, and if you're able to report to law enforcement or to these reporting portals. And then after that, you can evaluate whether or not the incident you witnessed was a hate crime, to follow up and report to FBI to respond to that. And so also I mentioned recording. I also want to say that you shouldn't publish it on social media until you get the consent of the victim of the hate incident, because you want to protect their identity and their safety as well. So yeah, those are the resources for that.
Of course, definitely Stop AAPI Hate, a very good resource as far as people reporting any sort of incidents across the country. I believe it's Dr. Russell Jung of San Francisco State University has been a big part of that. I myself, and I'm sure you have, as a reporter, have used them as a resource just to understand the magnitude of the incidents that we're seeing. I can say, at least here in Las Vegas, thankfully we have not seen the violent incidents that we have seen in other places, which is what I want to emphasize. It's a very good thing, but we still have incidences, about 30 according to Stop API Hate, of mostly verbal harassment, verbal abuse, someone saying, calling someone else China's virus or go back to your country, those sort of sentiments that don't necessarily, I would say, rise to the level of a criminal act, so to speak, but still incidents that impact our daily lives that are in some ways underreported. So definitely very important resources for anyone out there who either wants to report something or wants to understand what our community is going through. Now I'm going to go to you, Kat. Now we know how important the narratives are to a news story. Now, when writing about topics like anti-Asian violence, racism, what are some of the biggest things journalists should keep in mind to ensure that they're fair and accurate and not harming the AAPI community?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say start with following AJA. This is something I've been talking to our newsroom. It should not be something that only the AAPI journalists on staff are keeping an eye on with their new guidances and resources. Anyone can follow them, and they really are a great resource and very active on social media. So if you're a big Twitter or Instagram user, you will see their updates. And I also do think a lot of the importance comes from sourcing diversity and keeping in mind who we are interviewing for different stories. And especially after the Atlanta area shootings, it was very important to highlight the voices of Asian women. And a large part of why people were so upset by the comments that from the Georgia police saying that it was not racially motivated. It was the shooter trying to address a sex addiction, was because the intersection of racism and misogyny and sexism was not recognized. And so I think following the shootings and also just continuously, it is important to be mindful of how do we get more women voices in our reporting. And for example, when I was reporting on the Running to Protest rally the Sunday following the shootings, I saw that all of the organizers for this rally were men, and they're all doing incredible work. But I also know if I want to include 5 or 6 voices in my story, I also need to reach out or on the ground talk to women and just make sure that different perspectives are included in the story. And of course, this extends to many things, including talking to AAPI voices who are non-binary or from the LGBTQ community, in future stories. And I think there's just a lot more room for different voices to be highlighted and making sure that we are including all perspectives. Yeah, and then I would also say along those lines, this has been repeated a lot, but Asians are not a monolith. And I think at this moment, regarding the hate crimes and hate incidents, for example, many East Asians and Southeast Asians and South Asians are having very different experiences. And when I'm reporting, I'm being mindful of how do I make sure I don't only highlight the voices of East Asians, for example, if that is the community that I'm most familiar with, and because of language I have that connection, and to try to expand beyond that. And also for the AAPI conversation, making sure that the stories of Pacific Islanders are also included. And last year I attended the AAJA virtual convention, and one of their sessions was, focusing on reporting on Pacific Islanders. And while I was there, I was thinking, wow, I wish people of all newsrooms can attend the session because often they are left out of the conversation. I think it's important to just make sure that we're all included.
Absolutely. No, and I have to, as putting my reporting hat on, I would have to certainly agree with that. And I know news manager at my station has, particularly in reporting stories like this, actually have sound bites directly from those very same community members rather than just simply talking heads. I can tell you from my personal experience, just reporting on the Stop API hate stories, I always made sure to have sound bites from the local AAPI leaders in our community and try to diversify who they were, whether obviously I could speak Mandarin, so that you had your Mandarin speakers, but you also had a large Filipino population here in Las Vegas. You have to have the Filipino voice in there as well, just to show that they are in the community, for example. And as far as the non-AAPI voices or sound that mostly came from the governor or like our local leaders, as of right now we don't quite have that representation yet at that level, but absolutely so important to have the community members say what's on their mind in our news stories in order to illustrate truly what are some of the thoughts going on in our community. Thank you very much, Kat. Now we're going to head over to Mike. Now, something we don't talk about enough about, especially just, in the API community in general, is mental health, especially during COVID-19. Now, as part of the #IamNotAVirus campaign, you partnered with other entities to create a mental health workbook. Now, talk to us a little bit more about this initiative and why this is such an important part of efforts to protect the API community.
Thank you for that question. As Asian Americans, again, like I'm coming from a refugee background where my parents survived so much trauma. There's intergenerational trauma. There's trauma with immigrant communities that aren't often talked about, right? And it's because they're surviving. So having these resources for us to understand ourselves better allows us to love ourselves. Right now, we are seeing a proliferation of anti-Asian violence daily on our screens. We are seeing people that look like us. And when we see these attacks aren't, someone else. These attacks to us represent our parents, our grandparents. So every single attack is personal. And I think that's something that most Asian Americans recognize. I think most Asian Americans in this country has had their own experience with COVID-19 racism or knows someone that does, So our mental health workbook allows us to unpack these feelings, allows us to celebrate ourselves because that's often missing, right? And it makes it less taboo to talk about our feelings because we're not alone. Many of us are going through the same thing. Our first one was done with UConn American Studies Institute, and that was for Asian Americans, a broad range of Asian America. Our second issue is for queer Asian Americans. There's a poem in there titled "Reasons Why I Didn't Kill Myself." It's a strong poem from a queer poet of Filipino American descent, non-binary, and it is a powerful piece. And there's a prompt in there by Reggie Cabico. Reggie Cabico is from Capturing Fire Press, and he's also the first Asian American to win the Norwegian Slam Poetry. But we partnered with them to bring in these stories of queer Asian Americans, because the stories of queer Asian Americans, adopted Asian Americans, should be heard by all Asian Americans. Oftentimes we silo our differences to these intersectional differences, right? Where we may not let someone in because they didn't grow up in an Asian household, or maybe their experiences are different. So we don't hear these experiences, and it's hard for us to activate ourselves, and we are not aware of our differences. We're also creating a mental health workbook for queer families of color with the Concerned Parents of Color West Hartford, the GLOW Project, which is the queer Black liberation organization in Indiana, and with Kimura's Cultural Center, which is another queer entity within the state of Connecticut. So by bringing in these stories together, we're able to, I guess, understand ourselves better, be able to address that hurt that we're feeling. Because oftentimes when we are hurt or when our feelings are hurt, like I've been called dog eater in high school, right? I think many of us have had similar experiences. I think children are going to be called bad eaters going forward. And if they can't address why that hurts them, or if they're told that like, you should have tougher skin, what does that mean? It means we internalize this and we begin to hate ourselves. And we might not want to advocate for our communities, because we are embarrassed to be who we are. And we have to really unpack that. We have to give ourselves the language to love ourselves. And that's where this project came up. We are planning on doing many more in the future with different ethnic enclaves within Asian America. And kind of like, Kat was speaking about the South Asian experience, because the South Asian experience is different than the East Asian experience. But yeah.
Absolutely. Again, as mentioned before, the AAPI community by no means is a monolith with so many different groups having so many different types of experiences. I did want to go back to you, Mike, just talking about mental health, because that is particularly something that, unfortunately, still within the API community, there's a stigma to talk about mental health, talk about, what's going through our minds. I remember growing up, my parents, obviously fearful for anything, just told me, whatever someone calls you, just keep it to yourself. Don't stir the pot. Don't try to fight back. Don't do anything like that. How are you seeing, any sort of process, I guess progress, I should say, with people, talking more about mental health and trying to open up even more, especially with people, who are Asian Americans?
I think there's progress there. There's a lot of organizations that are out, like the Asian mental health page that's out on IG. That's extremely helpful. I think that our generation and the generation, I am 36, and I think, this generation and the generation coming after us are becoming more aware of their mental well-being, being able to take a break, being able to speak their own truths. And I see that happening because, my parents had to survive. They had to survive. They didn't have time for any of this. They escaped genocide. I think now Asian Americans are coming into their own, seeing that their stories aren't embarrassing, but loving themselves is key to moving forward. The mental health book that we published has been, it's free to download on our website. It's been downloaded about 5,000 times. It's used on about 24 different college campuses for Asian American students. So we're seeing this active usage with that, you know. Yeah.
It's good to hear. Good, definitely good to hear. I'm going to take it over to Maggie now. Some people may not believe that their individual voice matters and won't make a difference in the grand scheme of things. You know, how can people feel more empowered to use their voice and speak up?
I think it starts with, I mean, even a step back, like to this mental health conversation, which is so important, like knowing who you are and recognizing that and being okay with that. I think oftentimes there are parts of us that we don't like or that we're afraid of. And I think if COVID has taught us anything, like, you know, we've all spent a lot of time with ourselves. It's like not being afraid of those, right? Like this is who we are. And I think having the, you know, the strength to present that person that, you know, of all the aspects of who you are on an everyday basis in all your different interactions. And so something I wasn't good at was I would compartmentalize, right? As a different person at work, as a different person with my friends and this and that. But I think starting there and then from there, just, you know, taking the time to like I mean, I can say it, right? Your voice matters, your story matters, but you might not believe it. So, I mean, as homework, I would say, take the time to write your story or share your story with one person or even with yourself and then rip it up and, you know, throw it away. Like I actually had a friend who during the pandemic wrote a book of poetry, but just for herself. And then she decided to send it to a few friends and she actually printed it out and like bound it and sent it, mailed it to about 20 of us and was terrified. She told me she like didn't think anyone would read it and got such good feedback. You know, I was like, you should publish this, right? Like, and so it was these little steps of like, okay, well, I'm just going to write it down, but I don't have to show it to anyone. Okay, I'm going to write it down and show it to anyone. They're just my friends, right? And I think being able to take those steps, a lot of us, you know, feeling like if we jump off a cliff, we don't know what's going to be there. So I think just like do that one little thing, right? Make that one move and it's actually okay. And keep going from there. So I'd say, you know, write down your story, share your story with one person or share your story, you know, to yourself and then delete it. But then, you know, maybe tomorrow you'll feel like you can share it, you know, on a wider basis. So that's, you know, just one small step.
Of course. And do you feel like those strategies certainly helped yourself as you were going through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely, you know, I think, you know, we will feel the effects of this mentally long after the, you know, things are quote unquote back to normal. And so on the days when, you know, things just seem like disheartening, like right after the shootings, I was with a number of staffers from Mochi magazine and we were just tired, right? Like, it's like, this is not new. It's been going on. This just felt like just another thing. And you could see everyone was so weary and tired. And it was like, well, how do we keep going? And so it's one of those, like, just keep walking, right? And before you know it, you just have to like one foot after another, keep going. And that's been kind of my mantra over the last year is just, you know, get through another day. And eventually, you know, you kind of get to the other side.
Of course. Thanks for sharing that, Maggie. Let's go over to two. Now, many in the Asian communities are concerned for themselves and their loved ones. What services or resources are available for them so they can protect themselves and each other?
Sure. So I'll start with what's available out there is a few organizations are doing bystander intervention trainings, including OCA. So we have a situational awareness workshop. And so I'm going to drop a couple of links in the chat right now. But OCA situational awareness workshop kind of goes over both the historical context of anti-Asian hate and solidarity work, and then goes into bystander intervention tools. And then, you know, mental health was mentioned a lot. And so getting yourself, oh, we just dropped the same link, Mike. The AAPI mental health directory, getting yourself, your friends, your family connected to a culturally competent mental health provider is really important. But I would say it really is the resources in you and your community. A lot of our OCA chapters are coming together to form walking groups or buddy systems. You know, so I mentioned earlier, you know, community care and checking in with your friends, family, and neighbors. But yeah, extend, you know, as things are opening up again, and to the extent you feel safe, provide them with just your company and doing essential travel, if you're able to pick up groceries for them and be there for one another. I think the community care part, we've seen a lot of brutality, like forced brutality, not just anti-Asian hate, but police brutality. And so we want to also emphasize this restorative justice aspect of community care for ourselves and community like vigilance for each other. And so just looking out for each other and being there for one another. And I actually wanted to piggyback off of what Maggie was saying, where I think also just leveraging your platform online, your voice online. There's a lot of misinformation out there, misunderstanding of each other out there. And so a lot of the ways we can combat this hate as well, like Mike had mentioned, is education, right? And so I think it's as simple as sharing things on your social media from your API peers and API organizations who are putting out this information, because you don't know who your reach is. Like your reach is always going to be different from the person, the next person. And so you're always like, I've like informally tested this with all of my friends, and they've always reached someone new. There's always been someone new they were able to reach when they share out on social media. And so don't discount the power of that too.
Absolutely. Thank you very much too. And again, for everyone who's watching right now, in the chat box, you will see links to all these various resources like the ones Tu and Mike have mentioned during our talk. So feel free to save those links if you wish to use them. Now I'm going to switch over to Kat. Now, Kat, for you, what's perhaps been some of the most helpful resources in your reporting of anti-Asian incidents?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely start with just talking to community leaders like the panelists here, and also following the work that these organizations are doing. I'm definitely going to copy and paste everything dropped in the chat box, and was taking down notes for, let's say, 47,000 donors for the GoFundMe for Stop Asian Hate that Maggie mentioned, and also 5,000 downloads for mental health workbook, which Mike mentioned. That is amazing. And I think, a lot of the times, these people are the best resources when it comes to reporting on these stories. And I would also say oftentimes, once you do get introduced to leaders of an organization, that also can expand your network, or if you just go to one of their Instagram pages and see who they're following, go through different pages that these organizations are following. Oftentimes, all of the other people they're following are also great resources. So I've been trying to do more of that. And for instance, after writing a story on Raya and the Last Dragon, and about how there were missed opportunities for representation in that film, even though it was a huge step forward for representation, for instance, because of the overwhelmingly East Asian cast. Writing that story, I got connected to different Southeast Asian organizations, and now I'm following their posts more, and just trying to expand my network that way. And then separately, I would say when it comes to looking for historians or academics or scholars to talk to, also trying to find API voices in this time. And my colleagues have recommended this site called womenalsoknowhistory.com. And I think it's been very helpful in, it's not specific to API historians, but women historians in general. And I would have to say there are definitely times when I'm looking for experts for my stories, and spend a long time trying to find, someone from the BIPOC community or a women voice. So I think it's been a helpful resource to see different people's areas of expertise, and make sure that hopefully if I'm writing a story on a subject, I can find someone to talk to who can help contextualize, who is actually from that community.
Of course. And actually, Kat, I'm kind of interested, at Time Magazine, do you have sort of like an equality, diversity kind of committee at Time to talk about what you talked about, finding more diverse resources, more diverse contacts, or anything like that to kind of enhance your reporting?
Yeah, I would say our diversity committee was just launched, and have had one meeting. I'm a part of it. So we have not had, too many newsroom-wide announcements through that, but our BIPOC ERG and our API ERGs have been very active. Actually, they were started last year, and I think have been hosting both events within the ERG itself and also open to the larger newsroom. And I feel like these ERGs have been leading a lot of the conversations about, all the things that I just talked about.
Awesome. Well, a step in the right direction. All right. And then I'm going to head over to you, Mike. Now, from your perspective, what else can be done moving forward to ensure that the momentum continues and people keep raising awareness of the issue of, stop AAPI hate and, the other issues that pop up within our own community?
I just want to pick up what Kat just shared about the ERG group. These spaces that we exist in partnership with other folks are so important. Our stories are important. I know getting involved in, if you are a parent like I am, being involved in your local EDI parent groups, right? There's some uncomfortable conversations. I am the only Asian American on my parent group. And I've had a father tell me, an African father share with me that that we're talking about Latinx History Month and what to do for Latinx Month. And he shared that we don't know what to do because there's no one here to advocate for themselves. There's no one here to talk. And he goes, Mike, last year we had the same conversation with Asian American Month and you weren't here, So it's having our voices heard there. I spoke with a friend of mine that I photographed in the way beginning of the campaign and reconnected with. And her ERG group with her immediate supervisor, she's in a position of leadership, and with her immediate supervisor, in the beginning of the pandemic, he told her, I don't see race, And she said to him, I'm not comfortable having this conversation because I don't have the language to. And they revisited this conversation like a year later, and he's like, I'm so sorry I said that. Because he's into the fold now. So using our voices in these spaces and sharing our personal stories will inspire other people to join with us. I know with the bill for HB 6619, most of the people that shared it and through their networks were non-Asian Americans. They were members of these parent groups where, they sent it to their connections and their networks to uplift Asian American voices and to, be an allyship with us. So it's these active ways where sharing our stories can lead to participation and activation and mobilization of groups larger than just Asian America fighting for our rights. And at the same time, we also have to be there for other communities. We have to celebrate with other communities. My friend Adrienne Billing-Smith has Juneteenth recognized. She got it recognized last year, and she renamed our town to rename the Common Greens from a slave owner's name to Unity Green. That will highlight the past history of slavery within our district. And there's a mural. So showing up for other communities when they need it, if they need someone to lean on, we need to show up. When they're celebrating, we need to show up. And that's the only way we're going to be able to get through this together,
Absolutely, Mike. Now, this is a question pretty much for any one of you, and any of you can chime in, but something that we have been looking at is how do we address microaggressions in the workplace, whether it's peers, direct reports, and executives, and how do we enable, especially those who are superiors, enable them to be allies and watch out for that?
So I am self-employed, so I probably won't be able to answer that part. But I was talking to my son's teacher because I needed more representation within the classroom. I felt that they were reading about talking cats before they met any person of color, So we sent them a list of diverse books of different groups, including Asian Americans. And every time we spoke about Asian Americans, she would say something along the lines like, our ESOL teacher would like this. Our ESOL teacher would like this. This would be great for our immigrant students. And I have to win the staircase, and I am emotional. So I tend to get angry really fast and say what's on my mind. So I did take a minute to breathe, and I shared with her that Asian American stories, Asian AAPI stories are for all students and not just Asian American students or immigrant students. I shared that with her. I addressed it right then and there. And then afterwards, I sent a lengthy email to her with with my wife about how that made me feel. But I think we have to address these moments, especially when they're interpersonal relationships where it's someone that you see and you have you see them often. I think we need to advocate for ourselves. And it took, I think the teacher had to recognize her bias. She needed to do her own thing. And a few days later, she came back and thanked me for the advice. I had the same experience with our superintendent and our mayor at the beginning of May of last year after George Floyd and after Asian Americans were being attacked in Connecticut for 2 solid months and around the country for 2 months. There were no statements saying that we stand in partnership with Asian Americans or we demand the safety of Asian Americans. And I did reach out. I reached out and I said some stuff, and but I offered a bridge. So when Atlanta happened, they mobilized quickly because we're in partnership. Some people don't know what they don't know, and we don't say it, that they're going to continue to step on our toes, And I think what politicians, because right now these rallies are coming up and a lot of people want to speak here, but many people have had platforms for the past year. They've been in places of leadership. So we don't need them speaking for us. Like, they're more than welcome to come in, but we need action. I know Asian Americans, there's a phrase in Khmer, which is like, don't ask for a yard when you're given an inch. I say that we need to ask for that yard. We need to demand more. We need policies in place. We need frameworks in place. So when this happens, there's something that can be done, And yeah.
And speaking of all the policies and framework, Mike, do you think right now we saw the Biden administration already put out kind of an extensive thing to address specifically hate and racism towards the AAPI community? We're seeing some developments out of the federal level. Where do you think that stands, and where could we go from the future?
There was one that was with Senator Grace Meng today. I believe had 96 folks. Senator Blumenthal also put together a bipartisan one called Stop Hate that identifies the attacks against Asian Americans and would provide more resources to legislation efforts and persecution of hate crimes. And I was invited to be on this forum, I guess, this talk. And I did ask the senator. Sometimes I feel like I have imposter syndrome, like I shouldn't be here. And but I did ask for, one is language resource, because we do need language resource, and we do need education. Education is a big part. These hate crimes have existed since the 1800s, since the 1700s. These hate attacks, incidents, they've always existed. So we need to be seen within the classroom, and we need funding. And oftentimes when you build these types of curriculums, one of the questions you have are, well, is there funding for it? I think we need to find funding for it. I think it's a step in the right direction, but the main goal to protecting Asian American needs to start with education, having our stories told inside the classroom setting, and being seen in community with one another as instead of separate silos.
Let me unmute myself, of course, and thank you, Mike, for sharing that. I wanted to open it up to the other 3 panelists. Mike was talking about just the importance of education. I know there was a little bit of discussion about education, especially at the K-12 level. I can tell you from my experience growing up, there was not really much talk about the Asian community, even though I grew up in California with such a huge AAPI population over there. Really, in elementary school, the mentions of the API community was, the Chinese worked on the railroads, and that was about it. Just talking. I know it's difficult with such diversity within the AAPI community, but just in general, how important is just having that education, at such a young age, important to allow people to understand, or better understand our community.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so critical, but it's not something that you necessarily would see an immediate impact. And so it's like tough to really invest the time and energy to do it. One thing I think about a lot, just because I like to eat, is food, and this notion of, I guess, diplomacy through food. And there's, a lot of instances, and I remember growing up, right, and being ashamed of what was in my lunchbox. And that's kind of this classic story. But I think that being able to, start the conversation in at least have that beginning of that conversation, and then that can, bridge into something else. That's one thought that I had. And I think, learning about something and reading about something is one thing, but actually practicing it is another. And so back to the question around the workplace training, I think, attending a microaggression or bias training is great, but that might not immediately change your behaviors. And I'd like to think that people in the workplace have good intentions. And so it's about kind of consistently, reinforcing that and making sure that these things don't slide, right? So there's kind of this culture of enforcement. But yeah, I think back to the education point, so important. And I think there are ways to do it. We've also thought about at Gold House, getting messages through via music, right? So concerts, right? So the mental health side, inviting kids to concerts is fun, but like, let's actually slip in a message about mental health. So I like to think about it as how can we get people to the table, and then once they're there, they can start to have those conversations.
Absolutely, absolutely. And something that certainly has come to mind is, especially over the past few weeks, obviously there's been so many news stories just about how vocal our community is. I know particularly our parents, have always had that kind of attitude, like mentioned before, don't stir the pot. We don't need to, speak out. No need to fight back. We'll just internalize everything and whatnot. Obviously with our generation, that it's completely different, especially with us, being born and raised here and kind of being exposed to demonstrations, being exposed to activism that our parents in our home countries may not have been necessarily exposed to in that particular manner, I should say. Do you think there's kind of a permanent change in, how our community is going to be pretty vocal about, issues like racism, if they were to pop up? And this is a question for any of the panelists.
I'd like to begin the answer on this because one of the reasons why it is important to teach API history at such a young age is because I want to push back on the narrative that our community is just now being vocal and being organized. Our communities have been vocal since the moment we got here, with the Third World Liberation Front and pushing for API studies, to, organizers such as Larry Itliong. Our community, those are just two examples that come immediately to mind, but our community has long been organizing with other communities of color and organizing in our community, pushing against, perpetual foreigner, pushing against model minority myth. And so our resilience, we all come from a history, we come from a history of resilience and organizers. And so that's why it's important to teach API history. And then I also wanted to just build off of what Maggie was saying about, microaggressions, is that, folks might not know when something is a microaggression, both APIs who experience a microaggression, but also, the person who conducted the microaggression, right? And so I had a friend who told me she graciously, responded to this, where she entered a Zoom chat, a Zoom meeting with a gallery curator, and she was a docent, a gallery guide. And this curator had said, "Oh, Cindy, did you just come back from the country?" And that sounds really innocent, right? At first, but to my friend Cindy, who's Vietnamese American, born here, she had never left the country, and to her that was hurtful. And something is considered a microaggression when there is hurt, regardless of intent, right? And so, but the curator didn't know, that she was committing a microaggression. And so my friend Cindy sent an email afterwards explaining, hey, the fact that you had just assumed that I was a perpetual foreigner plays into this bigger, problem of anti-Asian hate. and perpetuating this perpetual foreigner stereotype. And so, what you did was a microaggression. And so I'm happy to talk about it more, but I hope that's what you did. And so the curator, was really grateful, sent a reply back, thank you for pointing that out because I didn't realize that. And so, these are all the different ways why education is so important.
And I wanted to bring back to mention, have any of you had sort of like a similar experience regarding that, where you got to educate someone else regarding, a microaggression that this other person, while, good-hearted and well-meaning, may not have realized it in the first place? And this is a question for any of the three others.
I mean, I don't think, I'm trying to be better at it because I think it happens so often that just like not letting it slip. But even I think now being in, mainly at home, and my parents are actually living with me, and if they say something or, there's a microaggression that they're watching the news and something happens, just, calling them out and not letting it go by. So I think just, again, it's on us to try. Like, I'm so used to not saying anything, right? So it's also this behavior change for me of making sure these microaggressions don't slip by.
Absolutely. Mike, any of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of one example where I guess someone in our newsroom assumed that I could speak Korean, or think that I'm Korean, and but they did apologize immediately. And I think it is so important to, when we do feel uncomfortable, to bring these comments up. And a lot of the times, the conversations are awkward and hard to have. But what I'm hearing a lot from this conversation is the person who made the comments afterward coming up to us to apologize. And I do feel like, thankfully, more often than not, that has also been my experience, even though, the initial calling out or pointing out something is not the most enjoyable thing to do.
Of course, of course.
I had it described as a call in or an equity pause. There was a rally that was planned in town, and I became friends with the organizer. I've been really fortunate because we've been working within our local communities. So the rally for Atlanta against anti-Asian hate was planned within a day after the event. So on that Friday, an Afro-Latino organizer planned this event and brought people together, high school students, Asian Americans, and gave us the mic. So we wouldn't have to do anything. But there was an incident on one of the local chats where people were coming out to kind of police what was happening in Atlanta. Some people wanted to push this narrative that it was a sex crime. Some people wanted to push this narrative that racism doesn't exist. And I was really fortunate because with these allies that we've been able to build, they were the ones that came in force to shut these conversations down. The statement that I provided for the town included that Asian Americans work in nail salons, we work in restaurants, and it's not just Asian Americans in Atlanta, but Asian Americans in your own community. We exist in these places, and the students are scared for their loved ones, and that needs to be recognized. And people were really upset that I listed Asian Americans and what they deemed were stereotypical roles, and these were non-Asian Americans. And but providing that legwork that we've been organizing and mobilizing for the past year, my allies came and defended us. So I think this interpersonal level of like changing minds one at a time, sharing our stories with people around us that are close to us, and helping them understand what we're going through, empowers them to speak out for us, so we don't have to be the only ones speaking out against anti-Asian violence.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Mike. Now we got about 5 minutes left in our panel, and I'm going to move it over to some final thoughts. So I just want to take a few moments to give our speakers a chance to give some closing remarks and last minute thoughts for our audience. And we'll start with two.
Thanks. I think final thoughts is just that in the past year, we've learned a lot about how interconnected a lot of the oppression that we face is. And so we've really seen the importance of solidarity with other communities of color. And we don't want to let white supremacy pit communities of colors against each other. And we want to make sure that narratives that are being told don't pit communities of color against each other.
Gotcha. And Mike?
I agree with everything Tu just said. You know, a lot of times when we see this violence unfold, the narrative is often shifted when it is Black on Asian violence. But you know, this violence against Asian Americans happen everywhere by many different groups. You know, we have to keep our we have to keep our eyes on white supremacism and what that means, and that, you know, oftentimes when authorities may be involved, they might not take it seriously, or they might see it as, you know, something not to really report or care about, you know. So we need to keep the focus on how these attacks are responded to in schools and in schools with classrooms and community levels. And the other thing is this push for Asian American Pacific Islander studies. You know, we have to really push for this all across, and we have to also push for this comprehensive ethnic studies for students, where they can hear the history of people of color, not in separate silos, but together. And stories of joy really, really matters in here. You know, like my son, my son started making rice with his mom because his teacher read Bibimbap by author, and in the book she helps her mom make rice and Bibimbap, and my son was so excited to make rice, and that's become his routine, you know. And but our stories of joy matter just as much as our struggles.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. We're going to move on to Kat for her final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, very similar to the note of, you know, focusing on joy and also resilience, like Tu mentioned earlier. I think I was very moved when I saw the Time team put together the cover that I referred to earlier. That's called "We Are Not Silent," and our amazing photo editor, Sangsuk Sylvia Kyung, she had reached out to Thai artist Amanda Pingbody Pakya, and her work right now is just everywhere in rallies and, you know, in her Instagram caption posting the cover. Yeah, she writes about how it's a reclamation of space, a celebration of our beauty and resilience. And I think, you know, a celebration of our beauty and resilience is so crucial in this moment. Like, yes, there is so much pain, and also in many ways the API community or individuals in the API community are victims, you know, in the attacks. But I also think there is such strong support and solidarity and just a collective fight against the racism that's happening right now. And, you know, when I saw this cover at the Columbus Park rally, you know, the week following the shootings, I just knew that so many people related to seeing an image of, you know, of strength and of resilience.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kat. And finally, we'll save the best for last, Maggie.
I'd say two things. One is reach out to, you know, one person who's not in your community, however that is, and have a conversation, check in on them, see how they're doing. The second one is do something for yourself. So I really hope, like, you know, this weekend, each and every one of you can take, whether it's 5 minutes or an hour, whatever that is, to do something that recharges you, or even just a pause, right? Whether it's meditating or something. I just think, you know, sometimes people say like taking a shower is like taking a shower is, you have to do that. That doesn't count, right? So do something that's like, that really just, it might feel luxurious, but just please take the time to do something for yourself. Because I think we're all so tired and so exhausted from this that we kind of need to breathe, and we're almost, I really do think we're almost to the other side.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much to you, Maggie, and of course, all of our other panelists too, Mike and Kat. Thank you again for coming today and providing your insight and expertise. We hope this will be a conversation that will continue, and please look out for updates from OCA Las Vegas on upcoming events, programs, and opportunities for discussion. Thank you to all of our sponsors for helping spread the word, and thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Please be kind, compassionate, and be safe. Have a good rest of your evening. Take care.